In the darkness of a deep cave in the Spanish mountains, one of humanity's oldest murder mysteries lies frozen in time. Nearly 500,000 years ago, a body was dumped unceremoniously down a vertical shaft, not buried with care, not consumed by scavengers, but deliberately discarded. This brutal murder, 430,000 years ago, may mark the beginning of a long story of interspecies rivalry, culminating in the extinction of one species and the birth of the Neanderthals, who themselves may be a hybrid of two species, one ancient and one modern. When researchers unearthed the shattered skull of this ancient individual at Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, they noticed something startling. Cranium 17, as it was later called, bore two nearly identical fractures to the forehead. These were not the result of a fall, nor the work of an animal. The pattern suggested deliberate, forceful blows, with a rock or a weapon, and worse, it appeared the same object had struck twice. There was no healing. This makes Cranium 17 the earliest undisputed murder victim in the human fossil record. The victim was a young adult male, likely part of a small, isolated population living in the cold, savage landscape of glacial Iberia during one of the most severe ice ages Europe had ever seen, marine isotope stage 12. For decades, Cranium 17 was viewed as a singular case, an anomaly. But now, researchers are beginning to see it as something more. The first hard evidence of interspecies conflict. Around the same time, perhaps within a few generations, another group of hominins was making their way into southern France, along the emerging green corridors of a Europe thawing after its long glacial winter. At Arago Cave near Tautavel, fossils from this second population show a markedly different morphology, exemplified by a skull known as Arago 21. Less specialized than the Neanderthal-like Cima fossils, the Arago hominins retained a more generalized anatomy, a flatter face, smaller brow ridges, and a more rounded skull. Their brains were about the same size as Cranium 17, around 1100 to 1200 cubic centimeters, but their brain case shape was more primitive. Their teeth, too, were less derived, suggesting they had not endured the same degree of isolation and harsh selection pressures. They were moving in, only 300 miles from Cima de los Huesos, and they were different. Could Cranium 17's death represent the earliest known act of territorial violence in Europe? Was it a murder within a group, or a sign of something more sinister, the clash of two distinct hominin species? Cima de los Huesos is unique not only for its number of fossils, over 28 individuals recovered, but for the combination of traits they exhibit. Their facial structure, dentition, and brow ridges place them squarely on the path to becoming Neanderthals. But this is where things get really interesting. The mitochondrial DNA story shows just how tangled early human evolution really is. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from one individual revealed an unexpected connection, not to Neanderthals, but to the mysterious Denisovans of East Asia who lived thousands of miles away. The presence of Denisovan-like mitochondrial DNA in a population that otherwise looks like early Neanderthals suggests that the Cima population inherited their mitochondria from an earlier Eurasian population, a deeply divergent branch that had split from both Neanderthals and modern humans around 1 million years ago. The population at Cima de los Huesos may have descended from a common ancestor of both Neanderthals and Denisovans. One possibility is that Denisovan-like mitochondrial DNA was present in the ancestral population and later replaced in Neanderthals by gene flow from another group. This lineage, it seems, became genetically isolated in glacial Iberia and began to drift. Genetic drift in small, isolated populations can do strange things. Traits may fix rapidly, and genetic quirks can spread unchecked. In this cold, rugged mountain basin, the Cima population, with their thick brow ridges, huge molars and projecting noses, were shaped by the harshness of their environment. Cut off from the wider Eurasian gene pool, they became something new. They became the core of what would later be called Neanderthaloids. But evolution is not a sealed chamber, Populations rise and fall, mix and move, and the arrival of the Arago hominins into southwestern Europe during the warm interglacial 424,000 to 374,000 years ago may have shattered the Sima group's isolation. The face of cranium-17 might bear the marks of the first contact and the first fatal blow. As the climate stabilized and the forests returned to Europe, a transformation began. Around 400,000 years ago, the European landscape became a fertile frontier for hominin expansion. From the Near East, perhaps even from within Africa, archaic Homo sapiens, not fully modern, but already showing hints of the future, began to move north and west. Indeed, this is a very plausible and increasingly supported hypothesis. And in Central Europe, where the green corridors of the Danube and Rhine offered passage, something remarkable occurred. In Germany, fossils like the enigmatic Steinheim skull and the Ehringsdorf remains began to show a new pattern, a blend of Neanderthal and modern traits. The Steinheim individual had a cranial capacity of 1,100 to 1,200 cubic centimeters, similar to Sima and Arago, but with a more rounded skull vault and a less massive face. These were not fully Neanderthals, but they weren't archaic either. They were something in between. At Bildungsleben, earlier fossils retained more archaic traits, closer to the Arago morphotype. But over time, the morphology began to shift toward the Neanderthal mode. Some paleoanthropologists see this as the emergence of hybrid populations formed by the interbreeding of early Neanderthal-like groups from the west and sapiens-like migrants from the southeast. German fossils from this period show a gradient. Some, like Bildungsleben, look more like Arago, while others, including Ehringsdorf and Steinheim, show emerging Neanderthal traits, aligning more closely with Sima de los Huesos. But it wasn't just biology that was changing. Something new was stirring in their behavior. At Schöningen in Lower Saxony, a stunning discovery pushed the timeline of complex tool use back to over 300,000 years ago. 8 wooden spears, perfectly shaped for throwing, were found alongside the remains of butchered horses and other game. These weren't crude sticks. They were balanced, finely crafted weapons, evidence of a sophisticated engineering and hunting strategy that required planning, cooperation, and precision. Until this point, hominin hunting was thought to rely mainly on close-quarters ambush or scavenging. But the Schöningen spears proved that these humans could strike from a distance, hunt in coordinated groups, and take down fast, dangerous prey. This wasn't just a technological leap, it was a revolution. Who made these weapons? No hominin bones were found with the spears, but given the timeline and geography, they may have been wielded by the hybrid populations emerging in Germany, descendants of Sima-like Neanderthals and incoming archaic Homo sapiens. This population, forged in the crucible of hybridization and tempered by innovation, may have represented the first humans to develop an aggressive, organized hunting strategy, not just for animals, but possibly for human rivals as well. Indeed, an aggressive military strategy is also a good evolutionary strategy. The concept of violence as a driver of evolution has long been controversial. For decades, anthropologists preferred to emphasize cooperation, community, and shared culture. But in recent years, a growing body of evidence has pointed to another force shaping the human story: strategic aggression. The murder at Sima de los Huesos, the spread of spear technology at Schöningen, and the rise of robust, cold-adapted Neanderthaloids with complex social behaviors all hint at a world in which conflict played a role in determining which populations survived and which faded away. In a glacial Europe where resources were scarce and winters were brutal, being able to defend territory, coordinate attacks, and eliminate competitors may have been as important as finding food. Groups that could organize militarily had an edge, not just in hunting, but in surviving encounters with other humans. This aggressive advantage may explain the disappearance of more archaic lineages like the Arago hominins of France. These populations, lacking the cold adaptations and social cohesion of the Neanderthal lineage, may have been outcompeted, or wiped out, by more organized and better armed rivals. By 250,000 years ago, the Neanderthal traits had spread across Europe. Fossils from Germany, France, and even Britain began to show the now familiar traits, projecting noses, massive brow ridges, and large brain cases. The descendants of Cima de los Huesos and the hybrids of Central Europe had won. They weren't just survivors. They were victors of an evolutionary arms race. What the story of Cima de los Huesos, Arago, and Schöningen reveals is not a linear path, but a braided stream of evolution. Different hominin populations, isolated by glaciers or distance, evolved in parallel, sometimes diverging, sometimes reconnecting. Through bursts of migration, evolution, and interbreeding, they shaped one another, sharing genes, tools, and survival strategies. So, the Neanderthals who eventually emerged across Ice Age Europe were not the product of a single lineage, but of multiple threads woven together. The Denisovan-like ancestry seen in Cima's mitochondrial DNA, the hybrid vigor of Central European populations, and perhaps even early Homo sapiens genes that found their way into the Neanderthal Y chromosome. This complex ancestry may explain why Neanderthals were so successful for so long, enduring nearly 400,000 years in one of the harshest environments on Earth. In the 1860s, referring to the Neanderthal skull, William King, an Irish geologist, wrote that darkness characterized the being to which the fossil belonged, and the thoughts and desires which once dwelt within it never soared beyond those of the brute, suggesting they were a separate, primitive species. When Cranium-17 fell, or was pushed into the darkness of Cima de los Huesos, the individual who struck those fatal blows had no idea that he was making history. But the violence encoded in that act, whether personal or strategic, echoes through the bones of our ancestors. It reminds us that evolution is not always gentle, that progress is not always peaceful, and that the capacity for violence, along with compassion, creativity, and cooperation, is part of what made us human.